The studio lights burned white-hot. Across America, millions of screens flickered with the same image. Bill O'Reilly leaning forward in his chair, pen jabbing the air like a prosecutor's finger, his voice climbing over the calm words of the woman sitting across from him. "Let me finish, Congresswoman." It was the 5th time he'd said it, the 5th interruption in less than 8 minutes. But this time, something was different. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean back defensively or fumble for words. Instead, she took one slow, measured breath, the kind trial lawyers take before delivering a closing argument they know will change everything. The camera caught it all. The slight shift in her posture, the unwavering eye contact, the faint smile that wasn't smugness but something far more dangerous to a man like O'Reilly. Certainty. When she spoke again, her words didn't just answer his question. They rewrote the entire conversation. They exposed the game he'd been playing for decades. And in less than 60 seconds, they turned one of cable news' most infamous interrupters into a man scrambling for control he'd already lost. The clip would be viewed over 50 million times in 24 hours. Headlines would call it the moment Bill O'Reilly finally met his match. Media analysts would dissect every second, frame by frame, calling it a masterclass in composure under fire. But before we reveal exactly what Congresswoman Crockett said that left O'Reilly speechless and forced him to change his entire approach mid-interview, you need to understand how two people from completely different worlds ended up in that studio, and why this confrontation was always inevitable. Because this wasn't just about interruptions. It was about power, respect, and what happens when someone who's faced far worse than a cable news bully refuses to be intimidated. Bill O'Reilly had built an empire on confrontation. For over 2 decades, he'd ruled cable news with an iron fist and a booming voice, turning political interviews into gladiator matches where he controlled every weapon. His show, The O'Reilly Factor, became the highest-rated program on Fox News, not because of thoughtful dialogue, but because viewers tuned in to watch him dominate, interrupt, challenge, dismiss, repeat. "That's ridiculous," became his trademark phrase, a verbal hammer he used to crush any argument he didn't like. Guests who came prepared with facts often left flustered, their carefully researched points buried under his relentless verbal assault. Media psychologist Dr. Helena Price once explained O'Reilly's technique in an academic paper. He doesn't interview. He performs dominance rituals. The interruption isn't about clarification. It's about establishing who controls the narrative. And for years it worked. Politicians, journalists, even authors promoting books, most folded under the pressure. They'd stumble over their words, get defensive, or lose their train of thought entirely. O'Reilly would pounce on every hesitation, twisting their words into sound bites that made him look sharp and them look weak. Even after leaving Fox News in 2017 amid scandal and controversy, O'Reilly refused to fade away. He rebuilt his brand through Fox Nation specials and independent productions, targeting a loyal audience that craved his combative style. At 73, he was still swinging. His producers knew exactly what worked. Book young, inexperienced politicians, ideally progressives, preferably women, people who hadn't yet learned how to handle his interruption tactics, people who would give him clips he could use to look tough and in control, which is exactly why they targeted Jasmine Crockett. On paper, she seemed perfect for O'Reilly's usual playbook, a first-term congresswoman from Texas, rising star in progressive circles, outspoken on social media, young, black, female, all factors that, statistically, meant she'd face more interruptions than her white male counterparts. Bill thought she'd be easy, a production assistant later admitted anonymously. He told us these new members always freeze up. They're used to friendly podcasts, not real pressure. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to research, was where Jasmine Crockett came from. Born in St. Louis to working-class parents, Crockett learned early that respect wasn't given freely. Her father worked double shifts as a mechanic. Her mother cleaned office buildings at night while attending community college during the day, determined to give her children opportunities she never had. "My parents taught me that hard work and preparation beat privilege every time," Crockett once said in an interview. "But they also taught me that some people will try to talk over you just because they think they can. And when that happens, you don't get louder, you get sharper, She carried that lesson through college, through law school, and into the courtrooms of Texas, where she spent 15 years as a trial attorney. Not corporate law, not cushy office negotiations, criminal defense, civil rights cases, the kind of law where your client's freedom depends on your ability to stay calm when prosecutors are trying to rattle you, where judges will shut you down if you're not precise, where one mistake can cost someone years of their life. Former colleague Marcus Washington remembered her courtroom presence vividly. Jasmine never lost her cool. Ever. I saw prosecutors try every trick, raised voices, personal attacks, procedural games. She'd just smile, wait for them to finish, then dismantle their case piece by piece. Judges loved her because she never wasted time on theatrics. She stuck to facts and law. She won cases that seemed impossible, defended clients against police misconduct, challenged systemic bias in sentencing, built a reputation as someone who didn't just argue, she prepared. When she transitioned into politics, running for the Texas House of Representatives and later Congress, she brought that same discipline. While other candidates relied on charisma and sound bites, Crockett studied policy like she was preparing for trial. She memorized data. She anticipated counter-arguments. She knew that in politics, just like in law, the person who controls the facts controls the outcome. By the time she reached Congress, she'd become known among colleagues as someone who didn't grandstand in hearings. She asked precise questions. She read entire bills. She did her homework, which is exactly what made O'Reilly's team so wrong about her. When his producers reached out to invite her on the show, her communications director, Alicia Thomas, immediately raised concerns. "We knew his reputation," Thomas later explained. "Everyone knows what he does. The interruptions, the gotcha questions, the editing that makes guests look bad. I told the Congresswoman we should decline." But Crockett saw something her team didn't: an opportunity. She said, "I've handled tougher cross-examinations than Bill O'Reilly," Thomas recalled. "And millions of people who need to hear about this legislation will never watch MSNBC or read policy papers. They watch Fox Nation. If I can reach even some of them, it's worth it." So she accepted, and then she did what she always did before a big case. She studied her opponent. The night before the interview, Crockett sat in her office watching hours of O'Reilly's previous interviews. She noted patterns: when he interrupted, what phrases triggered his attacks, how he tried to trap guests into emotional responses. She prepared short, fact-dense answers for every predictable question. She practiced staying calm when interrupted. She even rehearsed the exact tone and body language she'd use if he became aggressive. "I'm not walking into an ambush," she told her team. "I'm walking into a courtroom. And he's not the judge. He's opposing counsel trying to intimidate a witness. I've dealt with that 1,000 times." The next morning, as she walked into the Fox Nation studio, crew members noticed something unusual. She seemed completely relaxed. No nervousness, no last-minute prep, just quiet confidence. Bill O'Reilly, reviewing his notes backstage, barely glanced up when she arrived. He gave her a quick, perfunctory handshake. No warmth, no small talk, just business. "This will be quick," he'd told his team earlier. He had no idea he was about to face someone who'd spent her entire career preparing for moments exactly like this. The interview began with all the subtlety of a thunderclap. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, Democrat from Texas," O'Reilly announced, his tone flat, almost dismissive. "You've introduced an economic development bill that proposes significant government investments in underserved communities. At a time when inflation is crushing American families, how do you justify asking taxpayers to fund yet another big government spending program?" The question was loaded from the start, framed to make her sound fiscally irresponsible before she'd even spoken. Crockett smiled slightly, unfazed. "Thank you for having me, Bill. This legislation actually addresses inflation by—" "But it's still more government spending, isn't it?" O'Reilly cut in, barely 10 seconds into her answer. He leaned forward, his voice rising. "That's a fact. More taxpayer money going out the door. Yes or no?" The first interruption. Crockett paused for just a beat, long enough to let the interruption register, but not long enough to seem rattled. "If I could finish my point," she continued smoothly. The bill is fully funded by closing corporate tax loopholes that currently allow— That's always the excuse, O'Reilly interrupted again, waving his pen dismissively. Tax the corporations, tax the rich. Let's be honest with our viewers, Congresswoman. This is just wealth redistribution under a new label, right? The second interruption. Crockett's expression didn't change. Her hands remained calmly folded on her lap. That's not accurate, Bill. The funding mechanism is— Our viewers don't need a lecture on funding mechanisms, he snapped, cutting her off once more. They need straight answers. Why do Democrats always think spending other people's money fixes everything? The third interruption. In the control room, producers were nodding approvingly. This was classic O'Reilly, aggressive, controlling, keeping the guest on defense. Viewers at home would see him as tough, her as evasive. But something wasn't working the way it usually did. Congresswoman Crockett wasn't flustered. She wasn't getting defensive or emotional. Each time he interrupted, she simply paused, maintained eye contact, and calmly tried to continue her answer. Her composure was starting to become noticeable. O'Reilly pressed harder, sensing he needed to provoke a reaction. Let me ask you this, he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. Have you ever run a business? Have you ever had to make payroll? Or is this just another academic theory from someone who's never worked in the real economy? It was a personal attack designed to undermine her credibility. Crockett responded without missing a beat. I spent 15 years as a trial attorney in private practice, Bill. I understand economics, budgets, and accountability. And this bill— That's not the same as running a business, O'Reilly interrupted yet again the fourth time. Lawyers bill by the hour. Business owners take actual risks. There's a difference. The condescension was unmistakable. Crockett's slight smile remained. With respect, Bill, trial attorneys take significant risks. But let me address your actual concern about the bill. Let me finish, Congresswoman, O'Reilly snapped, cutting her off for the fifth time. His voice was sharp now, almost angry. That's how this works. I ask the questions here. You give straight answers without the political spin. He leaned even closer to the camera, performing for his audience. Now answer the question about your party's so-called economic plan without the talking points. The studio felt tense. Crew members exchanged glances. Even for O'Reilly, known for his aggressive style, this felt excessive. 5 interruptions in less than 8 minutes. But what happened next would become the most replayed moment in cable news that year. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett took a slow, deliberate breath. The kind of breath that signals a shift, a decision. The moment when someone who's been absorbing punches decides it's time to respond. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward aggressively. She simply looked directly at Bill O'Reilly with the steady gaze of someone who'd faced far more intimidating opponents in far higher stakes environments. When she spoke, her voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. Mr. O'Reilly, she began, you've interrupted me 5 times in less than 8 minutes. The words landed like a gavel. O'Reilly opened his mouth to respond, but something in her tone made him pause. I've done my best, Crockett continued, to respond with respect and substance. If you want an actual conversation, I'm happy to continue. But if this is just about creating conflict for ratings, we can stop here, and I'll gladly talk with journalists who care about facts. The control room went silent. On set, O'Reilly shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For a man who'd spent decades controlling every second of airtime, this was unfamiliar territory. I'm giving you tough questions, he said defensively. That's my job. If you can't handle— I welcome tough questions, Crockett interrupted, using his own tactic against him. What I don't welcome is being invited for an interview where I'm not allowed to answer them. There's a big difference between real journalism and performative interruption. The phrase performative interruption hit like a precision strike. O'Reilly's jaw tightened. Camera operators later said they'd never seen him look so off balance. He tried to regain control. Let's move on to crime in major cities, he said abruptly, attempting to change the subject. Your party has consistently— I'd be happy to discuss that, Crockett replied smoothly, her tone still perfectly even. But let's make sure we're actually having a conversation first. Will you allow me to finish my answers, Mr. O'Reilly, or should your viewers expect more interruptions? The question, delivered without anger but with unmistakable authority, froze the moment. It wasn't just a pushback. It was a challenge to his entire approach, delivered calmly, professionally, and in a way that made any further interruptions look petty and unprofessional. O'Reilly seemed genuinely stunned. "I let all my guests answer," he insisted, though his 5 previous interruptions had proven otherwise. "But I don't allow filibustering or talking points." Crockett's response was surgical. "Substantive answers require context, especially when we're talking about national economic policy. If you label every complete explanation as a filibuster while rewarding shallow sound bites, you're not informing your audience. You're shortchanging them." The statement landed with devastating precision. For the first time in recent memory, Bill O'Reilly had nothing to say. He shuffled his papers, clearly searching for a response that wouldn't make things worse. The silence stretched for 3 full seconds, an eternity in live television. Then Crockett did something even more powerful. She took control of the interview entirely. "Let me address your original question," she said, not waiting for his permission. "The economic development bill I've proposed isn't a traditional government spending plan. It's a public-private partnership model." She spoke clearly and confidently, her legal training evident in every word. "That means limited federal seed funding is used to attract much larger private investments. For every federal dollar invested, we've seen $9 of private capital flow into local economies." O'Reilly started to interrupt again, but Crockett calmly raised her hand, a subtle but unmistakable signal. And incredibly, he stopped. "In communities where similar models were piloted," she continued, "median household income rose by 23% over 5 years. Small business creation doubled, property values stabilized, and long-term residents weren't displaced. These aren't projections, Bill. This is data from real programs already running in Texas, Ohio, and Pennsylvania." Her tone remained steady, conversational, but absolutely authoritative. "The approach is based on models developed by Nobel Prize-winning economists, and it's already received bipartisan support in multiple state legislatures. In fact, Republican Governor Phil Scott of Vermont publicly praised its fiscal responsibility and return on investment." Then came the line that would be quoted in journalism classes for years. "So to directly answer your question, this isn't a tax and spend liberal policy. It's an evidence-based growth strategy supported by economists from across the political spectrum. It strengthens market efficiency, demands measurable outcomes, and ends automatically if benchmarks aren't met." She paused, letting that sink in. "I welcome tough questions about this approach, Bill, but those questions should reflect the actual policy, not partisan talking points." The reversal was complete. In less than 90 seconds, Congresswoman Crockett had transformed from interrupted guest into authoritative expert. She'd exposed O'Reilly's tactics, reclaimed the conversation, and delivered a substantive answer that was impossible to dismiss. The studio remained silent. O'Reilly, visibly uncomfortable, tried one last time to reassert himself. "Well, that sounds good in theory," he began weakly. "It's not theory," Crockett interjected smoothly. "We have 5 years of data from multiple states showing these same results. I can send your producers the full reports from the Brookings Institution and the American Enterprise Institute. They both confirm the model's effectiveness." By now, the power dynamic had completely flipped. The man who'd spent his career making guests squirm was now the one looking uncertain. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by visible discomfort. "Our viewers don't need an economics lecture," O'Reilly muttered, one last attempt to dismiss her. Crockett's response was delivered with a slight smile, not smug, but knowing. "Your viewers deserve accurate information about policies that shape their communities. If presenting facts feels like a lecture, maybe that says more about the depth of discussion on this program than it does about my answers." The silence that followed was deafening. Crew members later described it as the moment Bill O'Reilly realized he'd completely lost control, and there was no way to get it back without looking worse. Within seconds of the interview ending, the internet exploded. Clips of the exchange flooded Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Every platform lit up with variations of the same moment. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett calmly calling out Bill O'Reilly's fifth interruption and then methodically taking control of the entire conversation. The hashtag #LetHerFinish began trending within 20 minutes. By the 2-hour mark, the clip had been viewed over 5 million times. By the end of the day, that number had surpassed 50 million. News outlets scrambled to cover the story. CNN ran a segment titled "The Interview That Stopped Bill O'Reilly Cold." MSNBC's Morning Joe dedicated 15 minutes to analyzing Crockett's technique. Even conservative outlets couldn't ignore it. Media analyst Carlos Mendez appeared on multiple networks explaining what made the moment so powerful. What Congresswoman Crockett did wasn't just push back. She refused to play his game. She changed the entire dynamic of the interview, and O'Reilly had no choice but to follow her lead. Conservative commentator Brittany Hughes, while disagreeing with Crockett's politics, gave credit where it was due. Whether or not you share her views, you have to respect the skill. She stayed calm, precise, and professional. That's how you handle aggressive interviewers. Political strategists from both parties began dissecting every second. Communication professors added the clip to their syllabi. Journalism schools held debates about whether O'Reilly's style was ever defensible. The consensus was overwhelming. Crockett had delivered a masterclass. But the fallout went deeper than just viral fame. 3 days after the interview, Bill O'Reilly addressed the moment on his podcast, clearly feeling pressure to respond. "I asked tough questions and she gave detailed answers," he said, trying to sound unbothered. "That's how good interviews work. People saying I was stunned or wrong. I was listening as any professional host should." The spin was transparent. The footage told a different story. His visible discomfort, the defensive body language, the failed attempts to regain control. Media critics were merciless. O'Reilly spent decades building a brand on dominance, wrote journalist Amanda Torres in The Atlantic. But when faced with someone who refused to be dominated, his entire approach collapsed. And now he's pretending it was all part of the plan. For Crockett, however, the moment became something far more significant than just viral fame. She received interview requests from 60 Minutes, The View, The Daily Show, and dozens of other programs. But instead of chasing the spotlight, she used it strategically. On Morning Joe, she redirected the conversation back to policy. "I didn't go on that show to create a viral clip. I went to talk about real economic solutions for working families. The fact that being calm and factual made headlines says more about our media culture than about me." Her discipline impressed even skeptics. Back in Washington, something remarkable happened. Her colleagues started treating her differently. Political reporter Sandra Mitchell observed the shift firsthand. Before that moment, many saw her as just another freshman representative. Afterward, even senior members treated her with new respect. Committee hearings changed when she was present. People listened. Congressional communications teams noticed, too. Within weeks, dozens of offices, both Democrat and Republican, began requesting Crockett-style media training. Workshops on staying composed under pressure saw record demand. "We had members literally asking, 'How do I handle an interview like Jasmine Crockett did?'" said media consultant Rachel Hartman. It became a case study overnight. Journalism schools followed suit. Columbia, Northwestern, and USC all added the O'Reilly-Crockett exchange to their curricula. Professor Richard Torres explained, "Watch how Congresswoman Crockett directly addresses the real issue, the constant interruptions, and then guides the discussion back to substance. That's how you reestablish respect without losing composure." 6 months later, researchers confirmed what everyone had observed anecdotally. An independent research group called Mediascope recently released a study titled "The Crockett Effect: Changing Interview Dynamics in Political Media," and their findings were pretty eye-opening. First, they found that guest interruptions across political talk shows dropped by 23% in the 6 months after that viral interview. Even more interesting, the biggest change happened in interviews with women politicians, who've historically been interrupted much more often than their male counterparts. And it didn't stop there. Hosts across multiple networks started letting guests actually finish their answers more often. especially when those guests directly called out interruptions on air. "We're seeing what we call the Crockett Effect," the report concluded. A single high-profile moment where a guest refused to accept interruption culture has shifted expectations across the entire media landscape. The impact was undeniable. Even Bill O'Reilly himself seemed to change. 6 weeks after their first encounter, his team reached out to Crockett's office with an unexpected request. Would she come back for a follow-up interview? Her staff was skeptical. "We thought it might be a setup," Alicia Thomas admitted, "a chance for him to try to get revenge." But Crockett saw another opportunity. When she returned to O'Reilly's show, viewers immediately noticed the difference. His tone was calmer. His questions, while still tough, allowed space for answers. The interruptions were gone. "I think we had a constructive conversation last time," O'Reilly said in his opening remarks. "And I'd like to continue exploring your economic ideas in more detail." It was an astonishing transformation, and proof that even the most entrenched behaviors could change when challenged effectively. A year after that unforgettable exchange, the moment still resonates. Political figures preparing for tough interviews study the clip. Media trainers reference it as the gold standard for handling hostile questioning. Journalism professors use it to teach the difference between accountability and performance. But perhaps the most important lesson isn't about technique, it's about values. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't go viral because she shouted louder or played dirtier. She went viral because she refused to accept a broken standard of discourse. She insisted on respect, substance, and honesty. And she did it without losing her composure for even a moment. In an era when political interviews often resemble shouting matches, when interruptions are normalized, and when conflict gets more airtime than content, Crockett proved something essential. Preparation beats intimidation. Facts beat volume. Composure beats aggression. Media analyst Jennifer Crawford put it best. In an era where politics often looks more like a cage match than a debate, Jasmine Crockett proved that calmness and focus are more powerful than theatrics. That lesson reshaped how public figures prepare and how audiences expect journalists to behave. The fight for better, more substantive political discussions is far from over. But moments like this remind us what's possible when leaders refuse to play by the old rules, when they demand better, and when they prove, in real time, that another way is possible.